Hello and welcome to this next lesson in our topic of homeostasis. In previous lessons we've looked at the principles of homeostasis, we've looked at temperature regulation in ectotherms and endotherms, we've looked at the structure and function of the liver and the kidneys, and today we're going to be looking at the roles of hormones in osmoregulation. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to explain how the hormones ADH is used to regulate blood water levels. You should be able to explain the sequence of events that take place within the body to maintain optimum levels of water in the blood. And you should be able to evaluate why osmoregulation is a form of negative feedback. Now, last lesson we looked at the structure of the kidney, and we said that the kidney is made up of this medulla and cortex. The cortex is the outer white layer, whilst the inner darker layer is known as the medulla, and each kidney is made up of millions of these cortexes. Okay? So we can say that each kidney is made of millions of nephrons which carry out selective reabsorption. Selective reabsorption. And that is a key word that we didn't define last lesson, okay? And that's why I'm mentioning it now. So, as we do for any other keyword in my lessons, it's going to be in green. So, we've got the term selective reabsorption. Now, essentially, what we said last lesson was that in the Bowman's capsule, or the Riemann's capsule, blood is filtered in the glomerulus. Okay, the glomerulus is where blood has substances removed from it. As that substance is removed from the blood, it forms what's known as the filtrate. The filtrate then has all of the useful substances removed from it through the proximal convoluted tubule, through the loop of Henle, and through the distal convoluted tubule. Okay? So we can say selective reabsorption is where useful substances are reabsorbed from the glomerular filtrate, from the glomerular filtrate as it moves through the nephron. So, in our previous lesson, we detailed how useful substances are absorbed by the nephron. We talked about what happens in the glomerulus. We spoke about what happens in the proximal convoluted tubule, in the loop of Henle, and the proximal convoluted tubule. That whole process is known as selective reabsorption. The substances that are not absorbed are gotten rid of as waste through the urine. Okay? So we can say, and I'm going to put in regs, it's important, that substances that are not selectively reabsorbed are gotten rid of as waste through urine. Are gotten rid of as waste through the urine. Okay. Now, one useful substance that is selectively reabsorbed is water. Okay, water is a very useful substance. It's needed in various reactions for hydrolysis reactions. Okay, so we can say that one useful substance that is selectively reabsorbed is water. Now, the amount of water that is selectively reabsorbed depends on the amount of water found in the blood. Essentially, depends on the water potential of the blood. Okay? So we can say that one useful substance that is selectively reabsorbed is water, and we'll put a comma, but the amount of water reabsorbed depends on the water potential of the blood. Okay? Now, inside the blood, there are many solutes that change its water potential. If there's more solutes, therefore there will be a lower water potential. Okay? So we can say that inside the blood, are many solutes that change its water potential. It's the worst T ever. Apologies. That change its water potential. Now, as a rule of thumb, the more solutes you have, the lower the water potential. Okay? So we can say more solutes equals lower water potential. Okay? So if there's more solutes, there will be a lower water potential. Now, lower water potential in the blood is caused by a low intake of water, lots of sweating, or intake of solutes, such as lots of salt. Okay? So we can say that lower water potential lower water potential of the blood is caused by dot dot. We've got low intake of water, low intake of water. We've got lots of sweating. If you sweat a lot, you'll lose more water. So lots of sweating. And we've also got intake of many solutes. So the intake of solutes like ions. Okay? So we've said so far that each kidney is made up of millions of nephrons which carry out selective reabsorption. Selective reabsorption is where useful substances are reabsorbed from the glomerular filtrate as it moves through the nephron. Substances that are not selectively reabsorbed are gotten rid of as waste through urine. One of the useful substances that is selectively reabsorbed is water, but the amount of water reabsorbed depends on the water potential of the blood. Inside the blood there are many solutes that change its water potential. If there's more solutes, that usually means that there is a lower water potential and therefore a greater need for water. Lower water potential of the blood is caused by low intake of water, lots of sweating, and the intake of solutes like ions. Now, before I refresh the screen, I am going to write, because it's important in red, that low water potential of the blood means that more water is needed. Okay? If there is a low water potential, it means that more water is needed. So, let's refresh our screen so that we've got a bit more space. Now we can talk about now how the body responds to lower water potential in the blood. So we can say that the body responds to lower water potential in the blood by dot dot. Essentially, osmoreceptors inside of the brain detects a drop in water potential. So we can say that osmoreceptors in the brain, or in the hypothalamus to be specific, osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect a drop in the water potential of the blood. Detect a drop in water potential in the blood. So osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect a drop in water potential in the blood. Now, an osmoreceptor is something that we haven't spoken about yet. Osmoreceptor. Now, for those of you that are getting used to breaking words down, that I frequently do in my lessons, the word osmo literally means water. If it is a receptor, it detects something. So we can define osmoreceptors as receptors sensitive to the water potential of the blood. Sensitive to the water potential of the blood. So osmoreceptors are receptors sensitive to the water potential of the blood. Now, essentially, if there is a low water potential in the blood, osmoreceptors lose water. Water is drawn out of the osmoreceptor and moves into the blood, much like it would do to any other cells. As a result, the osmoreceptors shrink, which causes the hypothalamus to make something called antidiuretic hormone. Okay? So we can say, and this is an important point, that low water potential, I'm going to put it in red because it's important, low water potential within the blood causes water to move out of the osmoreceptor and into the blood. Out of the osmoreceptors and into the blood. Okay? Now, as the osmoreceptors shrink, they cause the hypothalamus to create something known as antigeretic hormone. So we can put another bullet point, and I'm going to switch to white because it's not as important. And we can say, as osmoreceptors shrink, in fact, now we'll say, as osmoreceptors lose water, apologies, comma, they shrink, causing the hypothalamus to produce antidiuretic hormone. Causing the hypothalamus to produce anti-diuretic, D-I-U-R-E-T-I-C, hormone. Now, antidiuretic hormone is a very important hormone, so we're going to have that as a keyword. So, antidiuretic hormone. For those of you that are fans of breaking words down like I am, the word diuretic means to become dehydrated. So it prevents you from becoming dehydrated. Now, antidiuretic hormone is frequently known as ADH. So for the remainder of this lesson, I will simply be writing it down as ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone has the definition taken straight from the biology dictionary as a hormone made in the hypothalamus. So a hormone made in the hypothalamus which is secreted by the posterior pituitary. Which is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland and reduces the amount of water in urine. And reduces the amount of water in urine. So antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, is a hormone made in the hypothalamus which is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland and reduces the amount of water in urine. So as the name suggests, or as the definition suggests, ADH is then released into the blood by the posterior pituitary. So we can add to our what happens when water potential drops in the blood, and we can say that ADH is passed from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland. Help if I put to the posterior pituitary gland, where it is released into the blood. Okay. So the body responds to lower water potential in the blood by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect a drop in water potential in the blood. Osmoreceptors are receptors that are sensitive to water potential of the blood. Low water potential within the blood causes water to move out of osmoreceptors and into the blood. As the osmoreceptors lose water, they shrink and cause the hypothalamus to produce antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. ADH is a hormone made in the hypothalamus which is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland and reduces the amount of water in urine. ADH, as the definition suggests, is passed from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland, where it is released into the blood. Okay? Now we are going to carry on with this, it's just I need to refresh the screen, so I'm going to keep the bullet points because this is all under this banner of how the body responds to lower water potential. So we're going to quickly set our screen back to black, and we're going to carry on with these bullet points. Now the ADH, once it's in the blood, enters the kidneys and binds to the surface of cells that make up the distal convoluted tubules. Okay, so we can say that from the blood, ADH enters the kidneys and binds to receptors, and I'm going to put that in a different color so it stands out, binds to receptors found on the surface of cells in the distal convoluted tubule. In fact, I'm going to go that color. Of the distal convoluted tubule. Okay. Now, when ADH binds to these cells, it activates an enzyme known as phosphorylase. Okay. So we can say that the binding of ADH to these cells activates the enzyme phosphorylase. Okay? Now, phosphorylase causes vesicles containing something known as aquaporins to bind with the membrane. Okay? So we can say that phosphorylase causes vesicles containing aquaporins. I'm running out of colours. Aquaporins to bind with the cell membrane. To bind with the cell membranes. Okay? This makes the cell more permeable to water. So I'm going to put in red, making the cell more permeable to water. Okay? So ADH, once it's in the blood, it enters the kidneys and it binds to receptors on the distal convoluted tubules. When it binds to these receptors, an enzyme known as phosphorylase is activated, which causes vesicles containing aquaporins to bind with the cell membrane of the cells in the distal convoluted tubules. This makes them more permeable to water. Now, aquaporins is an important definition, so it's worth us defining that as a key word. So an aquaporin is defined as membrane proteins that facilitate the movement of water across the membrane. The movement of water across the membrane. Essentially, to put this in layman's terms, the more aquaporins you have, the more water will be reabsorbed. So we can say that more aquaporins means more water reabsorption. More water reabsorption. Okay? At the same time, ADH also makes the collecting duct more permeable to urea, meaning that urea is taken away more quickly. Okay? So ADH, we can say as our next bullet point, ADH makes collecting ducts more permeable to urea, so it is taken away more quickly. It's important to note that the water reabsorbed here is what was lost from the blood in the Bowman's capsule. So it doesn't really increase the amount of water in the blood in the body. It just keeps it the same. It stops further water from being lost. Okay? So it doesn't increase the amount of water in the blood. The only way you can do that is by drinking more water. What it does is it stops water being lost. Okay? So we can say in red that it's, because this is quite important, it's an important concept to get right in your head. We can say that all of this prevents extra water being lost when water potential is low in the blood. Dash, it does not increase it. It does not increase water levels. So what I'm trying to say is, if I put this on here, make it a bit bigger so that we can refer to it. When water potential is low within the blood, what happens in every nephron in the kidney is that water is taken from the glomerulus by the Bowman's capsule and added to the glomerular filtrate. Water then moves as part of the filtrate through the proximal convoluted tubule, through the loop of Henle and into the distal convoluted tubule. When water levels are low, the hypothalamus has osmoreceptors in them that has water drawn out of them. This water causes these osmoreceptors to shrink, allowing the hypothalamus to produce Antigeretic Hormone, or ADH. The posterior pituitary then releases this ADH into the blood, and the blood then delivers this ADH to the cells of the distal convoluted tubule, which are then added to receptors. These receptors activate phosphorylase, which allows aquaporins inside of vesicles to join with the cell membrane, and overall makes the cells of this distal convoluted tubule more permeable to water. So more water is reabsorbed back into the blood. Now, this doesn't increase the amount of water inside the blood. It just reduces the amount of water lost through urine. Okay? This just prevents excess water being lost. It doesn't count as adding water back into the system. It keeps it the same. Okay? But that brings the question, and again we are going to keep the bullet points because this is still when water potential in the blood is low. That raises the question, how do we actually raise the amount of water in the blood? How do we raise the amount of water in the system? Well, essentially, at the same time as causing the hypothalamus to produce ADH, osmoreceptors send nerve impulses to the thirst part of the brain that gets us to drink water. So we can say that when they shrink, osmoreceptors send action potentials via nerves to the thirst part, I forgot to spell two, to the thirst part of the brain. Okay? This makes us drink more water. This forces us to drink water, which adds water back into the system. So we can say that this makes us drink water, adding it to the blood. Okay? Now, once water levels rise, osmoreceptors stop shrinking, water is reabsorbed back into the osmoreceptors and they are no longer shrunk, and it stops ADH being produced and released. So our final bit we can say for this section is that once water levels rise, so once blood water levels rise to their optimum, comma, osmoreceptors no longer lose water to the blood, and no longer shrink. If they are no longer shrunk, they no longer produce they no longer cause the hypothalamus to produce ADH, and therefore aquaporins do not bind with the membrane of the distal convoluted tubule, and therefore no action potentials are sent to the first part of the brain, and everything's hunky-dory. Okay, so they no longer shrink, comma, and the hypothalamus no longer produces ADH. Okay? So when osmoreceptors shrink, they send action potentials via nerves to the first part of the brain. This causes us to drink more water, which increases the amount of water in the blood. Once the water levels go back to their optimum, osmoreceptors no longer lose water to the blood, and therefore they no longer shrink, and therefore the hypothalamus no longer produces ADH, and no impulses are sent to the thirst center. I'll put there as well. And no impulses are sent to the thirst center, to the thirst center. Okay? Now, to finish off today's lesson, we need to talk about, and it is much shorter than the previous section, what happens when there is a high water potential in the blood. So we can say higher water potential of the blood higher water potential of the blood is caused by drinking a lot of water. So if you drink a lot of water, you can have a higher water potential in the blood, drinking a lot of water. It's also caused by solutes, such as salt, being used and not replaced. So lower solutes in the blood. So solutes in the blood being used and not replaced. So if you use lots of salts in the blood and they aren't replaced, you're going to have a higher water potential in the blood. So exactly like we did for the other one, we can say, and it will be much shorter, that the body responds to high water potential in the blood by ... Osmoreceptors, which again are in the hypothalamus, detect high amounts of water and send nerve impulses to the pituitary gland to reduce the amount of ADH released. So we can say that osmoreceptors detect the high water potential of the blood and send action potentials to the posterior pituitary gland to reduce the release of ADH. To reduce the release of ADH. Now, if we've got less ADH in the blood, that means that the cells in the distal convoluted tubule are less permeable to water, which means less water is reabsorbed. So we can say that less ADH in the blood means that the cells of the distal convoluted tubule are less permeable to water. We'll put that in red. That's the worst A ever. Are less permeable to water. Okay, so less water is reabsorbed. So we can put meaning less water is reabsorbed. So less water is reabsorbed. What this ultimately means is that more water is lost in the urine, and then once the levels return back to normal in the blood, ADH returns to normal levels. Okay? So we can just put that more water is lost as urine. More water is lost in urine. And we can also say that once levels return back to normal, once levels return back to normal, in fact, we'll make that a bit more specific. We can say once water levels or blood water levels, once blood water levels return back to normal, ADH is released. ADH is released in normal levels or in normal amounts. And that's it. That's all you need to know about when there's too much water. So higher water potential in the blood, which means there's too much water in the blood, can be caused by drinking a lot of water or using lots of solutes in the blood that aren't replaced. The body responds to high water potential in the blood by Osmoreceptors detect high water potential of the blood and send action potentials to the posterior pituitary gland to reduce the amount of ADH being released. Less ADH in the blood means that the cells of the distal convoluted tubule are less permeable to water, meaning less water is reabsorbed. This means that more water is lost in the urine. Once water levels return back to normal, ADH is released in normal amounts. One thing that we haven't mentioned is, and I sort of took it as a given that you would remember this, is low water potential is bad for the body purely because it absorbs water from cells of the body, causing them to shrivel and die. High water potential in the blood is also bad for the body because if water is in high amounts in the blood, it means that water moves into the cells of the body. As animal cells do not have a cell wall, they can expand and eventually burst. Therefore, it's important that we keep water levels at an optimum level in the blood so that cells don't shrivel and so that they do not burst. So by now, you should be able to explain how the hormone ADH is used to regulate blood water levels. You should be able to explain the sequence of events that take place within the body to maintain optimum levels of water in the blood. And you should be able to tell me why osmoregulation is a form of negative feedback. Should you have any questions about today's lesson, please do not hesitate to get in contact with me via the usual means. If not, I will see you in the next lesson. Thank you very much.